Imagine a queen who learned a whole new language while running a country, just so she could talk directly to foreign bigwigs. Picture another who brought super fancy, almost alien customs from her homeland that changed how a whole empire ate and dressed. And get this, one medieval royal lady was so into books and smarts that she helped kickstart a university that's still famous today. These aren't characters from a fantasy novel. They were real medieval queens whose brains and cultural savvy left a massive mark on history. Get ready to meet some of the most educated and cultured women to ever wear a crown in an age often unfairly called darker. Number 10. Gisela of Swabia, the empress who was a triple threat: brainy, powerful, and pious. Meet Gisela, a lady who lived way back in the early 11th century, born around 990. She wasn't just any noblewoman, she was destined for big things. Her family tree was packed with important people, including kings of Burgundy. Growing up in such an environment meant Gisela got an education that was top-notch for a girl in those days. Think less about swords and shields and more about books, languages. She likely knew Latin and different German dialects, and understanding the complex world of politics and religion. Her mom, Gerberga of Burgundy, was known for being super smart and deeply religious, and you can bet that rubbed off on Gisela. This early grounding in learning and piety would shape her entire life, especially when she eventually became the Holy Roman Empress. When Gisela married Conrad II and became empress, she didn't just sit back and look pretty. Oh no, she got involved. One of her biggest passions was supporting the church, but not just any old way. She was a huge fan of something called the Cluniac Reform. This was a big movement trying to make monasteries more devout, better educated, and less tangled up in worldly power grabs. Gisela poured resources into monasteries that followed these ideals, like the famous Limburg Abbey. She also strongly supported her husband Conrad's massive building project, the incredible Spire Cathedral, which was set to be one of the largest churches in the Christian world. Imagine the architects and master craftsmen flocking to her court. Her support meant these places became centers of learning and art, not just prayer. The Empress's court itself buzzed with scholarly activity. With Otho of Burgundy, a learned chaplain and writer who penned a biography of her husband, actually dedicated some of his important historical writings to Gisela herself, praising her wisdom and how well she spoke. This tells us she wasn't just a silent partner. People respected her intellect. She also commissioned beautiful illuminated manuscripts, those handwritten books with gorgeous golden decorations that were the treasures of the medieval world. Gisela wasn't just about funding big projects. She was known for her sharp mind and good judgment. Historical accounts suggest she was a trusted advisor to her husband, Emperor Conrad II. In an age where women's political voices were often quieted, Gisela's opinions mattered. She exchanged letters with important church leaders, discussing matters of faith and governance. This required a good understanding of complex theological and legal issues. Perhaps one of her most lasting intellectual contributions was her influence on her son, Henry III. She took his education very seriously, ensuring he grew up to be not just a powerful ruler, but also a learned and deeply religious one. Henry III would go on to be a major supporter of the church reforms his mother had championed, and his reign is often seen as a high point for the Holy Roman Empire in terms of its cultural and religious life. He was even called Henry the Pious, which says a lot about the values Gisela instilled in him. Her active involvement in his upbringing meant her intellectual and cultural legacy continued through the next generation. So, while you might not see Gisela of Swabia's name in every popular history book, her impact was real. She was a woman who used her education, her position, and her piety to foster a more learned and reformed church, support grand artistic endeavors, and ensure her son was well equipped to rule. She navigated the complex world of imperial politics with intelligence and grace. Her championing of the Cluniac Reforms helped shape the religious landscape of Europe, and her patronage contributed to the flourishing of Ottonian and early Romanesque art and architecture. She showed that an empress could be a major player in the cultural and intellectual life of her time, leaving behind a legacy of wisdom and devout action. Number 9. Anne of Bohemia, the good Queen Anne, who brought gentle glamour and sharp minds to England. Anne of Bohemia, who became Queen of England when she married Richard II in 1382, arrived in a new country with a reputation for being kind and cultured. Born into the incredibly sophisticated court of her father Charles IV, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Bohemia, Anne grew up in Prague, which was a dazzling hub of art learning and architectural innovation at the time. Charles IV founded the University of Prague, the first university in Central Europe, so Anne was surrounded by an atmosphere that valued education deeply. She was literate, which wasn't a given for all noblewomen, and she likely spoke several languages, including Czech, German, and Latin, before learning English. Her upbringing exposed her to some of the finest Gothic art and the burgeoning intellectual movements that were sweeping across Europe. When Anne came to England, she didn't just bring a royal title. She brought a touch of Bohemian elegance and a different cultural perspective people noticed. She's credited by some chroniclers with introducing new styles of dress and even the side saddle for women riding horses, which was a pretty big deal for how noble women got around. But her influence went deeper than fashion. Her Bohemian entourage included scholars and clergy, and through them, ideas from Central Europe found their way into English circles. One significant, though perhaps indirect, cultural impact was related to the writings of John Wycliffe, an English theologian whose ideas were challenging the church establishment. Some of Anne's Bohemian attendants were reportedly interested in Wycliffe's works, and they took copies back to Bohemia. These writings then played a part in fueling the Hussite movement, a major religious reform movement in Bohemia led by Jan Hus. It's a fascinating example of how cultural exchange at a royal court could have far-reaching unintended consequences. Anne herself was known for her piety and her gentle nature, earning her the nickname Good Queen Anne from the English people, who genuinely seemed to love her. Anne was also a reader. It's recorded that she owned Bibles in Latin, German, and Czech. This was quite remarkable for the time, as personal ownership of scriptures, especially in vernacular languages, the everyday languages people spoke, was not common, particularly for lay people, even royal ones. Her interest in religious texts suggests a personal depth of faith and a desire to engage with Scripture directly. This points to a level of education and intellectual curiosity that went beyond basic literacy. While she didn't rule in her own right or make grand political pronouncements in the way some other queens on this list did, her cultural impact was more subtle but still significant. She fostered a court atmosphere where learning and piety were valued. Her marriage to Richard II was also, by many accounts, a happy one, and her calming influence on the sometimes volatile king was noted by contemporaries. Her presence likely contributed to a more refined and international flavor at the English court. Sadly, Anne's life was cut short by plague in 1394, and Richard was devastated by her death. He even had the royal manor at Sheen, where she died, demolished because he couldn't bear the memories. Her early death meant her full potential as a cultural patron might not have been realized. However, for the 12 years she was Queen of England, Anne of Bohemia made her mark. She brought a distinct Central European cultural influence, fostered an environment where intellectual and religious ideas could be exchanged, and was herself an educated woman with a personal commitment to learning and faith. Her quiet dignity and the cultural connections she embodied made her a memorable figure. A good queen whose influence was felt in ways both big and small, from fashion trends to the spread of potentially revolutionary religious ideas. Number 8. Eleanor of Provence, the poet-queen who made England a little more fabulous. Eleanor of Provence, who became Queen of England by marrying King Henry III in 1236, was practically born into a world of poetry and song. She hailed from Provence in southern France, a region famous for its troubadours, sophisticated courtly culture, and a vibrant literary scene. Her father was Raymond Berenger V, Count of Provence, and her mother was Beatrice of Savoy. All 4 of their daughters, including Eleanor, became queens. This tells you something about the family's ambition and the quality of the upbringing these girls received. Eleanor would have been educated in the arts of being a noblewoman, which included literacy, likely in Provençal, her native tongue, and perhaps some Latin, music, and an appreciation for poetry. Given her background, it's highly probable she could not only read poetry, but also compose it, as was common among the cultured nobility of Provence. When Eleanor arrived in England, she brought a slice of that sunny, artistic Provençal culture with her. This wasn't always popular with everyone, especially some English nobles who were suspicious of foreigners and their influence. But Eleanor, a strong-willed and intelligent woman, wasn't easily deterred. She surrounded herself with relatives and fellow Provençals, which, while causing some political friction, also meant that their cultural tastes, their love for literature, elaborate feasts, and fine clothing began to permeate the English court. She was a significant patron of the arts. This meant she used her wealth and influence to support poets, musicians, and artists. Under her influence, the English court became more polished, more continental, and certainly more colorful. She was known for her expensive tastes in clothing and furnishings, importing luxurious silks and tapestries, which helped to elevate the standard of material culture in England. Eleanor was more than just a fashion plate or a party planner, though. She was literate and clearly valued learning. She maintained her own collection of books, which would have included romances, popular adventure and love stories of the day, poetry and religious texts. There's even evidence suggesting she wrote poetry herself, following the traditions of her homeland. While none of her poems survive with certainty, the contemporary perception of her as a cultured and literary figure is strong. She also played an active role in politics, sometimes acting as regent for Henry III when he was abroad. This required intelligence, diplomatic skill, and an understanding of governance, all of which point to a well-rounded education and a sharp mind. She was deeply involved in the upbringing and education of her children including the future King Edward I. She ensured they received a good education, and her cultural influence would have shaped their tastes as well. Eleanor of Provence's impact on English culture was significant. She helped to make the English court a more cosmopolitan and sophisticated place. Her patronage supported artists and writers, and her personal interest in literature fostered a cultured atmosphere. While some criticized her for her extravagance and for favoring her foreign relatives, there's no denying she brought a new level of elegance and artistic appreciation to England. She was a woman of learning and taste who understood the power of culture to enhance royal prestige. Her long queenship, she outlived Henry III by nearly 2 decades, allowed her to leave a lasting imprint. Through her, the rich literary traditions of Provence found a new audience and helped to enrich the cultural tapestry of medieval England, making it a little more fabulous, a little more poetic, and a lot more interesting. Number 7. Saint Margaret of Scotland, the royal bookworm who brought bling and blessings to Scotland. Margaret, who became Queen of Scotland by marrying King Malcolm III Canmore around 1070, was an English princess with a fascinating international background. She was born in Hungary, where her English father had been living. This meant she was exposed to different cultures from a young age. Her mother was Agatha, a relative of the Holy Roman Emperor, so Margaret had connections to some of the most powerful and cultured courts in Europe. She received a very good education for the time, deeply rooted in Christian piety, and she was known to be literate in Latin, the language of scholarship and the church. Her early life spent partly in the refined atmosphere of the Hungarian court, and later in England before the Norman conquest, instilled in her a love for learning, religion, and a more sophisticated way of life than what she would initially find in Scotland. When Margaret arrived in Scotland, it was a pretty rugged and, from her perspective, somewhat unrefined kingdom. But Margaret wasn't one to just accept the status quo. She was a woman on a mission, a gentle but determined reformer. One of her biggest focuses was the Scottish Church. She felt it had become isolated, and that some of its practices were out of step with the wider European Church, particularly the practices of Rome. Using her knowledge of Latin and her understanding of theology, she engaged in discussions with Scottish clergy, encouraging them to adopt Roman customs regarding things like the observance of Lent, Easter, and Sunday Mass. She promoted religious education and insisted on a more devout and learned clergy. She wasn't just talking the talk. She was walking the walk. She was incredibly devout herself, spending hours in prayer and charitable works. She famously used to wash the feet of the poor and feed orphans. Margaret was a true book lover. Her biographer Turgot of Durham, who was her confessor, tells us she had her own collection of beautifully illuminated religious books. One famous story recounts how a precious gospel book of hers, richly decorated with gold and jewels, was accidentally dropped into a river. It was later miraculously recovered, undamaged. This book, or one very similar, is sometimes identified as the St. Margaret's Gospels, now housed in the Bodleian Library at Oxford. Whether it's the exact one or not, the story highlights her deep reverence for sacred texts and the value she placed on books as objects of both faith and beauty. She actively encouraged reading and literacy, not just for herself, but also for her children, whom she ensured received an excellent education. 3 of her sons, Edgar, Alexander I, and David I, became kings of Scotland, and they continued her policies of religious reform and strengthening ties with Europe, partly thanks to the upbringing she gave them. Queen Margaret didn't just reform the church. She also brought a touch of continental elegance and refinement to the Scottish court. She encouraged the use of finer tableware, more luxurious clothing. She loved bright colors and imported fabrics, and generally a more civilized atmosphere as she saw it. She initiated the building of churches, including the Abbey at Dunfermline, where she was later buried. Her influence helped to make Scotland more connected to the mainstream of European Christian culture. After her death, she was widely revered for her piety and her good works, and she was eventually canonized as Saint Margaret of Scotland. She stands out as a queen who used her education, her strong faith, and her royal position to bring about significant cultural and religious change in her adopted country, leaving a legacy of learning, piety, and a more outward-looking Scotland. She was a true royal bookworm, whose love for God and knowledge helped transform a kingdom. Number 6. Jadwiga of Poland. The teen queen who gave up her jewels for books. Jadwiga, or Hedwig, became Queen of Poland in 1384, not as a consort, but as king in her own right, a crowned monarch at the tender age of 10. This itself was pretty extraordinary. She came from the powerful Angevin dynasty, the daughter of Louis I, King of Hungary and Poland. Her upbringing at the sophisticated courts of Buda and Visegrad in Hungary was top tier. She was highly educated, fluent in several languages, likely Latin essential for diplomacy and learning, Hungarian, Polish, and possibly German or Italian. She was also deeply religious from a young age, with a strong sense of duty. Imagine being a young girl already well-read and multilingual, suddenly thrust onto the throne of a large and important kingdom. Jadwiga handled it with a grace and wisdom that amazed many. One of Jadwiga's most famous and lasting contributions was her incredible support for learning, specifically the renewal and refoundation of the University of Krakow. The university had been initially founded by Casimir the Great, but had fallen into decline. Jadwiga understood the immense value of a strong center of learning for her kingdom. She didn't just give it a nod of approval. She poured her personal resources into it. There's a very famous story, almost a legend, but rooted in her known generosity, that she donated all her personal jewelry, her royal bling, to help fund the university. Whether it was all of it or a significant portion, her financial contributions were crucial. She also petitioned the Pope for the establishment of a faculty of theology, which was a big deal and required serious diplomatic effort and scholarly backing. Thanks to her efforts, the Krakow Academy, now known as the Jagiellonian University, was firmly re-established shortly after her death, based on her endowment and plans becoming a major intellectual center in Central and Eastern Europe for centuries. Jadwiga wasn't just a patron of institutions. She was personally involved in the cultural and intellectual life of her kingdom. She maintained a correspondence with learned individuals and was known for her wisdom in political and diplomatic matters, often acting as a mediator in disputes. She was a patron of arts and architecture, supporting the construction and decoration of churches. Her own deep piety also expressed itself in charitable work and a commitment to justice. She surrounded herself with educated advisors and promoted a culture of learning within her court. Despite marrying Vladislav I Jagiello, Grand Duke of Lithuania, which led to the union of Poland and Lithuania, a massive political event she agreed to for the good of her country and the Christianization of Lithuania, Jadwiga remained a powerful intellectual and spiritual force in Poland. She actively supported the translation of religious texts into Polish, making them more accessible to her people. Jadwiga died tragically young, only in her mid-20s, due to complications from childbirth. Her death was a massive blow to Poland. Yet, in her short reign, this highly educated, multilingual, and profoundly pious young queen achieved so much. Her dedication to the Krakow Academy alone would secure her place in history as a massive champion of education. She was a queen who truly understood that knowledge was power, not just for rulers but for the entire nation. Her actions showed she valued learning and spiritual growth over personal riches. Jadwiga is revered in Poland, not just as a great ruler and a unifier, but as a saint. She was canonized by the Catholic Church in 1997 and as a visionary who invested in the intellectual future of her country, proving that even a teen queen could leave an enduring legacy of enlightenment. Number 5. Matilda of Scotland. The saintly scholar queen who built bridges, literally. Matilda of Scotland, originally named Edith, became Queen of England when she married King Henry I in 1100. Her path to the throne was pretty interesting. She was the daughter of King Malcolm III of Scotland and Saint Margaret of Scotland. Yes, the very same book-loving queen we just met. This meant Matilda grew up in a household where learning, piety, and good works were highly valued. She and her sister Mary were sent to be educated in monasteries in England, first at Romsey Abbey and then at Wilton Abbey, both of which were known centers of female learning. Here, Matilda received an excellent education for a woman of her time. She became fluent in Latin, the language of scholarship and the church, and was also skilled in English and possibly French. She studied religious texts, classical literature, as much as was available, and music. Her aunt Christina was the abbess at Romsey and oversaw her education, ensuring she was not just learned, but also devout. When Matilda became queen, she brought this strong educational background and deep piety to the English court. She wasn't just a figurehead, she was actively involved in governance, especially when Henry I was away in Normandy, which was often. She would preside over the royal council and issue writs in her own name, which required a sharp intellect and a good understanding of law and administration. But her true passions lay in religion, charity, and learning. She was a huge patron of the church, founding and endowing religious houses. One of her most famous foundations was the Augustinian Priory of Holy Trinity, Aldgate, in London. She also commissioned William of Malmesbury, one of the leading historians of the age, to write a biography of her mother, St. Margaret, showing her commitment to preserving and promoting her family's legacy of piety and learning. Matilda was known as Good Queen Maud, or Matilda the Good, for a reason. She was incredibly charitable. Stories abound of her washing the feet of the poor, tending to the sick, and distributing alms generously. But her good works weren't just about personal acts of charity. She was also into public works projects that benefited her people. She famously commissioned the building of bridges, including one at Stratford-le-Bow in East London, which gave the area its name, Bow, referring to the arched shape of the bridge. This might seem like a practical thing, not necessarily cultured, but it shows a concern for infrastructure and the well-being of the populace, often a hallmark of an enlightened ruler. She also founded a leper hospital, St. Giles in the Fields, showing compassion for the most marginalized in society. Her court was also a place where literature and music were appreciated. She was known to support poets and musicians, and her own education would have made her a discerning patron. Matilda of Scotland's legacy is one of a queen who combined deep religious faith with a practical commitment to good governance and a genuine love for learning. Her education in the monastic tradition gave her the tools to be an effective queen and a significant cultural force. She fostered a more pious and learned atmosphere at court, supported important chroniclers and religious foundations, and literally built connections for her people. She ensured her children, particularly her daughter, Empress Matilda, who would later fight for the English throne, also received a strong education. Matilda of Scotland set a high bar for queenship, showing that a queen could be both devout and intellectually engaged, using her position to promote not just the spiritual, but also the material and cultural well-being of her kingdom. She was a true scholar queen with a heart for her people. Number 4. Blanche of Castile, the monarch who raised a saint and ruled a nation. Blanche of Castile, born in 1188, was a Spanish princess who became one of the most powerful and influential queens in French history. Her grandmother was none other than Eleanor of Aquitaine, more on her later, so a legacy of strong, intelligent women ran in her veins. Blanche's education would have been comprehensive for a royal lady of her time, focusing on religious instruction, languages, Castilian, Spanish, French, and likely Latin, household management on a grand scale. She married Louis VIII of France in 1200, a marriage designed to bring peace between France and England, as Blanche also had claims to the English throne through her grandmother. Little did anyone know just how crucial her sharp mind and strong character would become for France. Blanche's moment to truly shine and to show the depth of her capabilities came when her husband, Louis VIII, died in 1226, leaving their son Louis IX as king, and he was only 12 years old. Blanche stepped up as regent, ruling France with an iron will and incredible political savvy during a very turbulent period. Rebellious nobles thought they could take advantage of a child king and a foreign-born queen. They were wrong. Blanche skillfully navigated treacherous alliances, put down revolts, and secured the throne for her son. This wasn't just about brute force. It required immense intelligence, foresight, diplomatic skill, and an understanding of law and governance, all testament to her education and innate abilities. She wasn't just keeping the seat warm. She was actively shaping the kingdom. Beyond her political masterstrokes, Blanche was deeply invested in culture and religion, particularly in the education and moral upbringing of her son, the future St. Louis IX. She personally oversaw his education, instilling in him a profound sense of justice, piety, and a love for learning that would define his reign. She selected his tutors and ensured he was well versed in religious doctrine, history, and the principles of good kingship. It's said she told him she would rather see him die than commit a mortal sin. This intense moral focus, combined with a solid intellectual grounding, shaped Louis IX into one of medieval Europe's most revered kings. Blanche was also a significant patron of religious orders, especially the new mendicant orders like the Franciscans and Dominicans, who emphasized preaching, scholarship, and service to the poor. She founded Royaumont Abbey, a Cistercian monastery, which became an important center of learning and manuscript production. Blanche remained a powerful influence even after Louis IX came of age. He trusted her judgment implicitly and relied on her counsel. When Louis went on crusade, he left Blanche as regent of France once again, a sign of his ultimate confidence in her abilities. During this second regency, she continued to govern effectively, dealing with challenges like the Shepherd's Crusade with firmness and wisdom. Her court was a center of religious devotion, but also of cultural activity appropriate to a royal household. While perhaps not known for lavish artistic patronage in the style of some other queens, her support for religious institutions fostered an environment where learning and the production of religious art and texts flourished. Her personal piety was legendary, and she was seen as a model of queenly virtue and strength. Blanche of Castile was more than just a queen. She was a state builder, a king-maker, and a saint-maker in a way, and a woman whose intellect and education allowed her to dominate the political scene of one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms for decades. She was the ultimate mom, arch. Number 3. Theophanu Scleraina. The Byzantine bling queen who schooled an empire. Theophanu, who became Holy Roman Empress by marrying Otto II in 972, wasn't your average European princess. She hailed from the super-sophisticated, incredibly wealthy, and highly educated Byzantine Empire, specifically Constantinople. Theories about her exact parentage vary, but she was definitely from the top drawer of Byzantine aristocracy, possibly related to the Emperor John I Damaskes. Imagine growing up in a city that was the envy of the world, filled with stunning art, ancient libraries, and scholars who still studied classical Greek texts. Theophanu would have received an education far surpassing what most Western European noblewomen could dream of. She was likely literate in Greek, the language of Byzantine high culture, and possibly Latin. She would have been versed in theology, history, court etiquette, which was incredibly complex in Byzantium, and perhaps even some of the sciences as they were understood then. When Theophanu arrived in the Holy Roman Empire, which covered much of modern-day Germany and Italy, it was like someone from a glittering, advanced civilization landing in a somewhat more rustic land. She brought with her not just a political alliance, but a wave of Byzantine culture. Her entourage included scholars, artists, and craftsmen who introduced new styles and techniques. She's often credited with popularizing certain luxury items and customs in the West. Think finer silks, more elaborate jewelry, ivory carvings, and perhaps even some culinary innovations. Some sources even suggest she might have helped introduce the fork to parts of Western Europe. Though this is debated, it symbolizes the kind of refined living she represented. Her presence definitely added a layer of glamour and sophistication to the Ottonian court. She was known for her intelligence and her strong personality, and she didn't just blend in, she stood out. Theophanu was more than just a carrier of culture. She was a political powerhouse, especially after her husband Otto II died unexpectedly in 983, leaving their son Otto III as a mere toddler. Just like Blanche of Castile later, Theophanu stepped up as regent for her young son, and she ruled with remarkable skill and authority for about 7 years. She issued charters and diplomas in her own name, calling herself Imperator Augustus, Emperor, in some documents, which was a bold claim for a woman at the time, showing her confidence and her Byzantine understanding of imperial power. She navigated complex political challenges, including threats from rival dukes and Danish invasions. She maintained peace and stability in the empire, often traveling extensively with her son to assert their authority. Her Greek education and Byzantine background likely gave her a broader, jolting perspective and different models of rulership to draw upon. She even managed diplomatic relations with Byzantium, her homeland. Theophanu took the education of her son Otto III very seriously. she ensured he received an excellent and multifaceted education, with tutors who could teach him both Western and Byzantine traditions. One of his most famous tutors was Gerbert of Aurillac, later Pope Sylvester II, one of the most brilliant scholars of his age. Otto III grew up to be a highly intellectual and idealistic ruler, dreaming of a renewed Roman Empire that blended Roman, Byzantine, and Germanic traditions, a vision undoubtedly influenced by his mother. Theophanu's regency and her cultural influence helped to create a unique Ottonian Renaissance, a period of flourishing art, architecture, and learning that drew on both classical and Byzantine models. Illuminated manuscripts from this era, like the Gospels of Otto III, show clear Byzantine artistic influences. Theophanu was an empress who truly bridged East and West, bringing not just bling but also brains and a powerful model of female rulership to the Holy Roman Empire, leaving an indelible mark on its culture and politics. Number 2. Isabella I of Castile, the queen who mastered a new language while conquering the world. Isabella I of Castile, who reigned from 1474 to 1504, is one of history's most famous and formidable queens. Born in 1451, her early life was not one of guaranteed power. She had to fight for her throne. Her formal education as a young princess was typical for her station, focusing on religion, needlework, and the Castilian language. However, Isabella possessed a fierce intelligence and an unquenchable thirst for knowledge that went far beyond the norm. She recognized the importance of learning for a ruler, and remarkably, as an adult queen with immense responsibilities, she decided to learn Latin. This wasn't just a hobby. Latin was the language of diplomacy, law, scholarship, and the church across Europe. By learning it, Isabella could engage directly with foreign ambassadors, understand complex legal and theological texts without relying solely on translators, and project an image of intellectual gravitas. Imagine leading a country, managing wars, and still finding time for Latin lessons. Isabella's reign, alongside her husband Ferdinand II of Aragon, was a period of monumental change for Spain and the world. This was the era of the completion of the Reconquista, the unification of Spain, the Spanish Inquisition, and famously the voyages of Christopher Columbus. While these events are complex and often controversial, Isabella's role as a patron of learning and culture within this context is undeniable. She was a devout Catholic, and much of her patronage was directed towards religious institutions and scholarship. She supported the reform of religious orders and was keen to ensure a well-educated clergy. She collected a significant personal library, filled with religious works, chronicles, classical texts, and romances. She wasn't just collecting them for show, she was a reader. She understood the power of the newly invented printing press and encouraged its use in Spain, leading to the dissemination of books and learning on a wider scale than ever before. The Queen was a major patron of scholars, artists, and architects. She attracted learned men to her court, including humanists who were part of the burgeoning Renaissance movement. Antonio de Nebrija, a prominent Spanish humanist, dedicated his groundbreaking Gramática de la Lengua Castellana, Grammar of the Castilian Language, the first grammar of a modern European language, to Queen Isabella in 1492. This was a landmark achievement, helping to standardize and elevate the Castilian language. Isabella also commissioned important architectural projects, including churches, monasteries, and palaces, often in the distinctive Isabelline Gothic style that bears her name. She supported universities, such as Salamanca and Alcalá de Henares, contributing to Spain's reputation as a center of learning. Her court was a vibrant place, fostering music and the arts, though always within a framework of religious piety and royal authority. Isabella I was deeply involved in the education of her own children, including Catherine of Aragon, future first wife of Henry VIII of England, ensuring they received a thorough humanist education that was quite advanced for royal women of the time. This commitment to her children's intellectual development shows her personal belief in the value of learning. Isabella's reign was a paradox in many ways, a time of great cultural flourishing alongside religious intolerance. But focusing on her role as an educated and cultured individual, she was a queen who actively pursued knowledge for herself, championed scholarship and the arts, understood the judging power of new technologies, like the printing press, and used her immense power to foster an environment where learning, at least for some, could thrive. Her decision to learn Latin as a busy ruling queen speaks volumes about her dedication to being the most capable and informed monarch she could be. Number 1. Eleanor of Aquitaine, the queen who basically invented romance as we know it. Eleanor of Aquitaine, born around 1122, was one of the most powerful, wealthiest, and downright fascinating women of the entire Middle Ages. She wasn't just a queen, she was a duchess in her own right, ruling over the vast and culturally rich lands of Aquitaine in southwestern France from the age of 15. Aquitaine, particularly its southern part, Gascony, and the courted Poitiers, was a vibrant center of troubadour, poetry, music, and a sophisticated courtly culture that celebrated themes of chivalry and romantic love, a very different vibe from the more austere courts further north. Eleanor grew up immersed in this world. Her grandfather, William IX of Aquitaine, was one of the earliest known troubadours himself. Eleanor received an excellent education for her time. She was literate, likely fluent in her native Occitan, the language of the troubadours, French, and she learned Latin. She was also skilled in music, mathematics, and possibly even astronomy and history. This was a woman prepared to rule and to lead culturally. Eleanor was Queen Consort of France through her marriage to Louis VII, and later Queen Consort of England through her marriage to Henry II. She even went on the Second Crusade. But it was perhaps at her own courts, both in Aquitaine and later during periods when she had influence in England or was effectively ruling Aquitaine again, that her cultural impact was most profound. She was an immense patron of poets, troubadours, and writers. These weren't just any poets. They were the rock stars of their day, composing elaborate songs and poems about love, honor, and adventure. Eleanor's court became a legendary center for this courtly love tradition. This was a new-ish idea in Europe, a refined and often idealized concept of love between knights and ladies, emphasizing devotion, service, and emotional intensity. The literature and music she championed helped to spread these ideas throughout Europe, profoundly influencing Western concepts of romance, chivalry, and even how stories were told. Think of the Arthurian legends. Many of their romantic themes were developed and popularized in circles influenced by Eleanor and her daughters. Eleanor didn't just passively listen to poems. She fostered an environment where artistic creation was highly valued and rewarded. Chroniclers of the time noted the brilliance and refinement of her courts. She supported figures like Wace, who wrote his Roman de Brut, a history of Britain in French verse that included Arthurian material, and dedicated it to her, and Benoit de Saint-Maur, whose Roman de Troyes, Romance of Troy, was also hugely popular. She understood the power of storytelling and how it could shape culture and enhance prestige. Her daughters, Marie of Champagne and Alix of Blois, also became major patrons of literature, continuing their mother's legacy. Marie, in particular, is famously associated with Chrétien de Troyes, one of the greatest romance writers of the Middle Ages, who credited her with giving him the matter and spirit for his Lancelot story. This shows how Eleanor's influence rippled through generations. Beyond her artistic patronage, Eleanor was a woman of formidable intellect and political acumen, ruling vast territories and navigating incredibly complex political situations, often in conflict with her powerful husband Henry II or her sons. Her long life, she lived into her 80s, an incredible feat for the time, and her vast experiences from the courts of Paris and London to the Crusader states and her beloved Aquitaine gave her a unique perspective. She was a major player on the European stage for most of the 12th century. While inventing romance might be a bit of a BuzzFeed exaggeration, Eleanor of Aquitaine's role in championing and popularizing the ideals of courtly love and chivalric romance through her patronage was so significant that it fundamentally shaped European literature and culture for centuries to come. Her education, her innate intelligence, her vast wealth, and her passion for the arts made her a cultural titan, a queen, whose legacy in the world of letters and love is still felt today.